Following his victory over Demetrius at the Battle of Gaza in 312 BCE, Ptolemy had established himself as the dominant force on the eastern Mediterranean coast, and had nearly obliterated the holdings and army of Demetrius, the young son of the old general Antigonus. Antigonus meanwhile had removed Cassander and his allies from Asia Minor, and most of the Peloponnese, but had little success against Cassander in Macedon, or against Lysimachus in Thrace to the north. With things going well for Ptolemy, Seleucus, with Ptolemy's blessing and a small contingent of 800 infantry and 200 cavalry, left Ptolemy's employ to attempt to retake his former satrapy of Babylon, a move that would not please Antigonus, who had chased him out of office prior to the war starting. G'day and welcome back to the Research Project History. In this episode we'll be taking a look at the campaigning season of 311, which ended the Third War of the Diadochi. Before we jump into it, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Thanks. Seleucus's plan was a bold one, especially with such limited resources. Despite the near irrelevancy of the force he had with him, little more than a bodyguard that it was, Seleucus had reason to believe this would not come into account. He had ruled the satrapy with the goodwill of the people, having treated them fairly, especially when contrasted to Antigonus's often heavy-handed approach to the eastern provinces, and Antigonus's desire not to appoint any satrap who was too popular with their local population, seen in his removal of Eucestes from power, and the outright execution of Python, who was formerly an ally and commander of Antigonus's own left flank in the closing stages of the Second War of the Diadochi, that had at that time just wrapped up. Seleucus had also stuck with his marriage to the Persian Apama, who he had married in Alexander's grand ceremony in 324, when Alexander had married 80 of his companions to Persian nobility. Many had left their Persian wives following the death of Alexander, but Seleucus had remained with Apama, a move no doubt favoured by the Persian elite. Added to this, Antigonus was at the time in the far reaches of Asia Minor, in the region of the Propontis. This meant there was a decreased risk of the local population remaining loyal to Antigonus and opposing Seleucus's return to power, especially as his ally Ptolemy was currently dominant on the Mediterranean coastline, in a position to block or at least challenge an Antigonid return to the far east of the empire. As confident as Seleucus was, his men did not share the same enthusiasm, possibly thinking they would have been better off remaining with Ptolemy in the relative safety of Egypt, rather than in this seeming kamikaze mission into the old Persian homelands, where, despite the lack of immediate Antigonid control, those left in command by the old general possessed large, well-resourced armies and a host of allies in the immediate vicinity. Observing the terror-stricken state of his troops, Seleucus endeavoured to bolster their morale by emphasising the utility of experience and skill in overcoming challenging circumstances, rather than sheer might alone. He reminded them that their prowess, acquired through their campaigns under Alexander, should have taught them this. Rather, they should draw upon the example of Alexander, who had achieved greatness and universal acclaim through his strategic prowess. Seleucus further encouraged his troops by claiming his victory had been prophesied by the gods. He told them of an oracle in Brandicae, where he had been addressed as King Seleucus in a dream in which Alexander, standing beside him, revealed to him that he was destined for leadership within the empire. Furthermore, Seleucus underscored the value of hard work and sacrifice, reminding them that the things most admired about people are often the result of their perseverance and willingness to face challenges. He also tried to foster a sense of camaraderie among his soldiers, treating them as equals, praising their strengths, and attempted to get them to view the mission as their own as much as it was their general's. Following the Fertile Crescent around from the Mediterranean coast, Seleucus entered the region of Mesopotamia from the north, arriving initially at Carrhae, modern Haran, on Turkey's southern border with Syria. Persuading a sufficient portion of the population to join him, he was then able to compel the rest. From there, he set out to the south, with a journey reminiscent of Napoleon's return to power following his exile to Elba, with the towns and cities on his route turning over and declaring themselves on his side, and the snowball effect on the size of the army he had at his disposal made it easier for the next group encountered to side with him. His march through the region was not entirely unopposed, and at an unnamed location, after Polyarchus had come over to him with more than 1,000 soldiers, Diaphilus and others loyal to Antigonus holed themselves up in a citadel in defiance of Seleucus. Undeterred, Seleucus stormed the citadel, taking it by force, in turn releasing a number of his friends and allies who had been confined to the citadel by order of Antigonus because of their loyalty to Seleucus. With a now vastly reinforced army compared to the mere 1,000 he had set out with, Seleucus was able, through friendly negotiation and pressure, to return to control of Babylon. Now returned to his satrapy, Seleucus was not yet out of the woods. Nicanor, the satrap of Media and ally of Antigonus, gathered a large force of over 10,000 infantry and approximately 7,000 cavalry from Media, Persia, and neighbouring lands. Seleucus, greatly outnumbered, did not wait for reinforcements, and set out to confront the challenger, with a combined force of over 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. Crossing the Tigris River, Seleucus, upon learning that the enemy was only a few days' march away, concealed his soldiers in marshes along the river, intending to ambush Nicanor and launch a surprise attack. Nicanor arrived at the Tigris River, and finding no enemy presence, he camped at one of the royal stations, the rest and resupply stops located on the Persian royal road network. Assuming that Seleucus and his army had retreated from his advance, Nicanor felt he was in a safe position. As night fell, the army of Nicanor, relying on their assumed safety, maintained only a perfunctory night watch to guard the camp. Moving out from their hiding places along the marshes, Seleucus launched a sudden attack, causing widespread confusion and panic in Nicanor's camp. The Persians, having joined with Nicanor, were routed, along with their satrap Vega, as well as several other leaders who met their end in the confusion. This unexpected victory for Seleucus resulted in the majority of the soldiers surrendering to him, partly due to fear and partly due to their dissatisfaction with how Antigonus had managed the affairs in the east. Abandoned, with only a few men and fearing capture, Nicanor fled with his companions through the desert. Seleucus, now with an even more substantial army, demonstrated his tactical nous with the deployment of soft power, and utilising a gracious demeanour, won over Susa in Media, the former winter capital of the Achaemenid Empire, in the lower Zagros Mountains, along with some of the adjacent territories. Following which, he dispatched a letter to Ptolemy and his other allies, boasting of his achievement and newfound power. Meanwhile, Ptolemy remained in Syria after defeating Antigonus's son Demetrius in the decisive Battle of Gaza and his subsequent victories along the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean. Upon learning that Demetrius had returned from Sicilia and was encamped in Upper Syria, Ptolemy selected Cilles, the Macedonian, and provided him with a substantial army, and instructed him to either drive Demetrius completely out of Syria or capture and defeat him. While Cilles was on his way to confront him, Demetrius received intelligence from spies that Cilles was carelessly encamped at a now unknown location called Myus. Demetrius abandoned his baggage train and marched with his soldiers in light equipment. Reaching Myus in the early morning watch, Demetrius launched an attack on the unsuspecting camp of Cilles and captured the army with hardly a fight, and took Cilles as prisoner. This unexpected success convinced Demetrius that he had overcome a significant portion of his losses in the previous year. Anticipating a potential Ptolemaic response, Demetrius retreated to his camp, strategically positioning it between swamps and marshes as defensive barriers to limit the avenues of attack open to Ptolemy. Secure as he could make himself for now, Demetrius sent a letter to Antigonus, notifying him of his triumph over Ptolemy's army, while also urging his father to send an army promptly or invade Syria himself in support against Ptolemy. Antigonus was at the time relatively close by in Cyllene in Phrygia, on the other side of the Taurus Mountains. Upon receiving the letter, he was filled with joy at the prospect of his son, despite his young age, emerging victorious from his precarious situation that he had been in and demonstrating his suitability for the throne. Heeding to his son's call, Antigonus and his army departed from Phrygia, crossed the Taurus mountains, and joined Demetrius within a few days. Upon learning of Antigonus's arrival, Ptolemy convened his leaders and friends for council. They debated whether it was preferable to remain in Syria and finalise a decision there, or to withdraw to the safety of Egypt, and continue the war as he had done previously against Perdiccas in the first war of the Diadochi. All advised him against engaging in battle, against an army that was significantly superior in strength and possessed a large number of elephants, as well as going up against an as yet unconquered general. They asserted that it would be considerably more advantageous for him to settle the war in Egypt, where he had ample supplies and could rely on the geographical challenges of both the Sinai Desert and the defence behind the rivers and channels of the Nile Delta that had proved too difficult for Perdiccas. Always one to minimise risk, Ptolemy listened to the advice and consequently decided to depart from Syria without a fight. However, to lessen Antigonus's advantage in victory, Ptolemy demolished the most prominent cities he had captured. Arche, now Acco in Phoenician Syria, Joppa in Samaria, and Gaza to the south, returning to Egypt with the army and all the loot that could be transported or carried. With the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean now back under his control, Antigonus turned his attention to the Nabateans, a nomadic tribe that traversed the desert region between the Red Sea and the Euphrates River, with a capital in Petra, modern Jordan. No clear motive is given for the attack on the Nabateans, Diodorus merely stating that they were hostile to his interests, although notably this region falls between Antigonus's holdings in Syria and Seleucus's in Babylon and Media and Ptolemy's in Egypt. It seems likely that Antigonus wanted to drive a wedge between Seleucus and Ptolemy, and also remove a relatively powerful and independent force from the region, who, if push came to shove, would more likely side with Ptolemaic Egypt due to an ongoing trade relationship. Selecting one of his friends, Athenaeus, he equipped him with 4,000 light infantry and 600 light cavalry, a force designed with speed in mind, and commissioned him with the task of capturing the Nabateans' cattle. At a certain time of year, the Nabateans met at a place called the Rock, from the descriptions likely to be Petra, a natural stronghold with narrow crevasses and high cliffs to trade with each other. It was also the location where they stored their wealth and housed their elderly, mothers and children, while out collecting items to trade and graze their cattle. Athenaeus waited until this time of year, and after travelling for 3 days and nights, fell on the city in the middle of the night and took it quickly, with there seeming to be a relatively low amount of people in the city. He killed some of the people caught in the city and took others prisoners, while also plundering the myrrh and frankincense, key trade goods of the Nabateans, and 500 talents, or about 40 kilos, of silver. Expecting to face a retaliatory attack by the Nabateans, the army departed before dawn, marching 35 kilometres before establishing camp, no doubt exhausted after 4 days and 3 nights of travel through the deserts and mountains. As expected, when the Nabateans found out from the wounded who had been left in the city what had been perpetrated against them, they gathered a force of 8,000 javelin-wielding cavalry and set off in speedy pursuit of their attackers. Thinking they had evaded the Nabateans, Athenaeus had set up his camp without due diligence for defence, an uncommonly common occurrence it seems in this year, or possible evidence of inaccurate reporting by Hieronymus or interpretation by Diodorus. During the night, some of the prisoners managed to escape and guided the Nabatean cavalry into the camp, where, outnumbering the Greek force 2-1, they slaughtered almost all of them where they slept, with only about 50 of the cavalry managing to escape the bloodbath. Athenaeus is not mentioned in the sources after this battle, so it is quite likely that he paid for his error with his life. Having successfully defeated their enemy, the Nabateans returned to the rock with the recovered people and property. There they wrote a letter to Antigonus, accusing Athenaeus and vindicating themselves. Antigonus sent a reply, acknowledging their self-defence and claiming that Athenaeus had not been following orders in his attack, wanting to make the Nabateans think that he, Antigonus, meant them no harm, and to lull them into a false sense of security. This would allow him to launch another attack to achieve his goal. The Nabateans, relieved and grateful for Antigonus's response, were nonetheless not entirely convinced by his words, and placed watchmen on high vantage points to monitor the passes into Arabia as a precaution. Antigonus, believing they had been deceived, sought to exploit his perceived advantage. He selected 4,000 light infantry and over 4,000 cavalry, again set up for speed, but with a significantly bolstered cavalry, up from 600 on the previous attempt. He further assisted them by providing the army with several days of food that did not require cooking. Placing his son Demetrius in command, Antigonus sent them off in the early evening, instructing Demetrius to punish the Nabateans in whatever way he could. Demetrius, determined to avoid detection, advanced for 3 days cross-country, avoiding the roads. However, the lookout spotted them and informed the Nabateans through fire signals. Realising that Antigonus had renewed his attack, they quickly sent their property to the rock and fortified it with a garrison, knowing there was only one approach, likely the narrow shaft called Alsic, a 1.2 kilometre passageway as narrow as 3 metres wide in points, and with walls approaching 200 metres high. They also divided their flocks, driving some into one area and others into another. Upon arriving at the rock, Demetrius launched repeated assaults on the stronghold. The defenders resisted valiantly, easily gaining the upper hand due to the natural defences. After enduring the battle all day until the evening, Demetrius recalled his soldiers for the night. The next day, as Demetrius advanced towards the rock, a Nabatean envoy questioned Demetrius's motive for the war, saying, and I quote, "King Demetrius, with what desire or under what compulsion do you war against us who live in the desert, and in a land that has neither water nor grain, nor wine, nor any other thing whatever of those that pertain to the necessities of life among you? For we, since we are in no way willing to be slaves, have all taken refuge in a land that lacks all the things that are valued among other peoples, and have chosen to live a life in the desert, and one altogether like that of wild beasts, harming you not at all. We therefore beg both you and your father to do us no injury, but, after receiving gifts from us, to withdraw your army and henceforth regard the Nabateans as your friends. For neither can you, if you wish, remain here many days, since you lack water and all other necessary supplies, nor can you force us to live a different life. But you will have a few captives, disheartened slaves, who would not consent to live among strange ways." Either convinced by the arguments, or realising he had no way of breaking into the city, Demetrius withdrew his army, and ordered the Nabateans to send an embassy to negotiate. The oldest men of the Nabatean delegation repeated their previous arguments, persuading Demetrius to accept a payment to call off the attack and to come to terms. Returning to Antigonus with the hostages and gifts negotiated from the Nabateans, Demetrius reported on the events of his campaign. Antigonus fiercely disagreed with the decision to come to terms, arguing it would make the Nabateans bolder against Antigonid interests, safe in the knowledge that they had a fortress to retreat to that Antigonus's army could not overcome. However, another piece of news interested Antigonus. Demetrius had observed at the Dead Sea asphalt, which occurs naturally there, bubbling up from below ground, either in tar pits around the sea or floating up to the surface in blocks. This was a valuable trade resource, used in mummification and waterproofing, and a potentially lucrative income stream for Antigonus. He commissioned Hieronymus of Cardia, the historian and Diodorus's key source for the period, to lead an expedition to harvest the asphalt. However, this expedition ended in further disaster for Antigonus, after the Nabateans sailed up on rafts to the Antigonus boats collecting the asphalt and killed almost all the workers with arrows. Giving up on his feud with the Nabateans due to the mounting losses he had accrued, Antigonus's focus was quickly drawn away to the east and Seleucus. A messenger had arrived with news from Nicanor, the satrap of Media ousted by Seleucus, with news of Seleucus's reconquest of Babylon and other areas of the Far East. Concerned about his control of the Far East, Antigonus once again dispatched Demetrius, this time with a vast army of 5,000 Macedonian and 10,000 mercenary infantry, and 4,000 cavalry to wrest back control of Babylon, before returning to winter quarters for the winter of 311-310, closer to the Mediterranean, and in a consolidated position with his father. With limited time, Demetrius set out from Damascus in Syria in the late summer or autumn of 311, and carried out his father's orders with enthusiasm. Patrocles, who had been appointed general in command of Babylon by Seleucus, heard that Demetrius and his army was on the frontiers of Mesopotamia. He was worried that he had insufficient men at hand to confront Demetrius. Therefore, he ordered the civilians to leave the city. Some were instructed to cross the Euphrates and take refuge in the desert, while others were to pass over the Tigris and seek refuge in Susa or in the Red Sea region. Patrocles himself, with the soldiers he had, used river courses and canals as defences and moved around the satrapy, watching the enemy. He also sent word to Media to Seleucus about the situation and urged him to send aid as soon as possible. Upon arriving in Babylon, Demetrius found the city abandoned of its citizenry. He began to besiege the fortified citadels held by those loyal to Seleucus. He captured one of the citadels and gave it to his soldiers for plundering as a reward. He besieged the other citadel for a few days before leaving Archelaus, one of his friends, as general for the siege. This was an early experience for Demetrius with siege warfare, and he would later be known as Demetrius Poliorcetes, that is, Demetrius the besieger of cities. He gave Archelaus 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, while Demetrius marched back to the Mediterranean and his father with the rest of the army. With his son busy prosecuting his interests in the east, and having lost a significant portion of his army, with Demetrius's defeat at Gaza and Athenaeus' defeat against the Nabateans, along with Nicanor's losses at the Tigris, Antigonus came to terms with his foes in the war, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus, and negotiated a treaty which came to be known as the Peace of the Dynasts. The treaty established that Cassander would be general of Europe until Alexander, the son of Roxanne, and Alexander the Great came of age. Lysimachus would rule Thrace, and Ptolemy would rule Egypt and the cities adjacent to it in Libya and Arabia. Antigonus would have hegemony in all Asia, and the Greeks would be autonomous city-states. Seleucus was notably not included in the peace, and the Babylonian Chronicle records that fighting continued between Seleucus and Antigonus after the conclusion of the Peace of the Dynasts in 311. The terms of this treaty left Cassander in particular vulnerable to the growing Alexander IV, who, about 12 at the time of the treaty, would at 14 come of age and be given increased power if things were to stay as they were. Combined with this, there were growing murmurings that the boy and his mother were prisoners of Cassander, and it was about time that Alexander be given charge of the empire. Not willing to risk the handover of power, Cassander commissioned Glaucias, the guard of the two, to secretly dispatch the remnants of the Argead dynasty, thus confirming the end of Alexander's empire, and the increasingly firm divisions that over a decade of rule and conflict had set in place. It is unclear exactly when these assassinations were carried out. Diodorus includes it directly after the Peace of 311, but it may have occurred as late as the summer of 309, when the boy would have reached 14. The secret nature of the assassination no doubt hindering our ability to know for sure. This confusion is further added to with the actions from the other Diadochs, who, unsure of how to respond to this, continued, it seems, with the pretense that they were ruling with the delegated authority of the Argead house, while they waited for the next king to emerge, despite the fact there was no one to take a united throne. This is seen in their continued use of the same titles as they had before, and in Babylon, the use of Alexander IV's regnal years all the way through to either 306 or 305. At or around the same time, Heracles, the illegitimate son of Alexander the Great and Barcenae, began to have his cause championed by Polyperchon. Again, Cassander was opposed to any other focus of popularity and power in his realm, and in 310 or 309 bribed Polyperchon to kill him. Despite much fighting, this war had ended in a stalemate, with the borders and regions of control essentially where they were at the start, except for Seleucus in the east. Although, even then, his removal from Babylon was an immediate precursor to the war. With things remaining as they were, it can be argued that it was an overall victory for Antigonus, as he had got the three Diadochi of Ptolemy, Cassander and Lysimachus to accept the regions that they already controlled, going directly against their demand that he share territory that started the war. For Ptolemy, this was a particular blow, as he had abandoned hope for control of the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, and had also opted not to help his former minion and ally Seleucus, who he had promised to help. On the other hand, Antigonus had started the war in a dominant position, with resources to spare, and he had used up much of those resources without ousting the three Diadochi from their key holdings, and his grip on the Far East had crumbled, with Seleucus returning and even expanding the power beyond what he had previously held. Having fought so hard to get nowhere, again with the exception of Seleucus and Antigonus in the east, the fight seems to have been taken out of the Diadochi for the next few years, and apart from minor skirmishes, widespread conflict was avoided all the way through to 307. That's all for this one. Next time we'll be taking a look at the Babylonian War, the continuation of the fighting between Antigonus and Seleucus for the next few years. As always, the key sources that I've used are listed in the description below, and if you can, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thanks.